We believed the humans would be simple. That was the first lie we told ourselves: soft, comforting, and disastrously convenient. In the earliest cycles of their discovery, humanity existed only as data streams and distant sensor ghosts, grainy transmissions leaking from a yellow star system choked with radiation, noise, and the static of constant conflict. Their worlds burned too hot, their gravity pulled too hard, their atmospheres flirted endlessly with toxicity. No species with sense would have chosen such cradles. Humans had not chosen them. They had endured them. From the high halls of the Kalari Concord, we watched without urgency. We had seen thousands of emergent species. Most followed predictable arcs: curiosity, expansion, collapse, absorption. The humans appeared no different: short-lived, soft-bodied, violently divided, barely capable of sustaining faster-than-light travel with catastrophic failure rates. Unfinished, we called them. I was assigned to the First Contact archives during this period, tasked with translating intercepted human broadcasts, fiction, news, personal records. It was tedious work at first. Their languages were crude but expressive, their history saturated with war, conflict after conflict, planetary, ideological, internal. They fought themselves with an intimacy that bordered on obsession. And yet, there was no grand design behind it, no unifying doctrine, no vision of galactic destiny. Their stories did not glorify conquest or transcendence. They glorified survival, holding the line, making it through one more night, crawling forward when logic demanded surrender. This puzzled me. Most species, when faced with repeated self-inflicted catastrophe, learned restraint. Humans learned persistence. When their climates collapsed, they adapted. When their societies fractured, they rebuilt differently. Never better in our eyes, but always functional enough to continue. When extinction loomed, they did not pray for rescue. They innovated, improvised, and endured. Again, and again, and again. I flagged this pattern in my reports, quietly at first, then with growing insistence. The response from the council was dismissive, almost amused. Endurance is not strength, they told me. They were not wrong by Concord standards. Strength to us was elegance, efficiency, the ability to dominate without resistance. Humans possessed none of these traits in abundance. Their ships were inelegant slabs of reinforced metal. Their technology favored redundancy over refinement. Their expansion lacked ambition. So we labeled them Category Amber, unstable, containable. The classification satisfied protocol. It allowed trade restrictions, observation, containment if necessary. It reassured the conchoid that humanity posed no existential concern. But classifications do not erase patterns. What unsettled me most was not what humans were, but what they refused to become. They did not stabilize. They did not unify under singular authority. They did not abandon dangerous worlds for safer ones. They stayed where conditions were worst and learned to thrive there. A species that normalizes adversity does not fear escalation. I recorded that thought once, then deleted it. It sounded alarmist. Instead, I left a note buried in the archive logs, hidden beneath layers of confidence and procedural certainty, a personal annotation, never meant for council eyes. Any species that survives itself may one day survive us. At the time, it felt like caution, academic curiosity, a footnote to history. I did not yet understand it as prophecy. Because far beyond our archives, beyond our classifications and calm deliberations, humanity was still learning the same lesson it always had, that the universe is hostile. And they were becoming very, very good at living in hostile places. The next cycle would prove just how cataclysmic our underestimation had been. Humanity did not expand the way empires do. There were no declarations, no banners unfurled across the stars, no ceremonial fleets announcing arrival. If one were not watching carefully, if one relied only on official reports and trade manifests, it would have been easy to miss them entirely. They spread the way mold spreads in darkness, slowly, quietly, relentlessly. From my observation post along the Concord's outer margins, I began to notice patterns that did not align with our projections. Systems long written off as economically worthless began reporting activity. Ruined worlds, those stripped bare by ancient wars or stellar instability, showed signs of habitation. Not terraforming, not restoration, occupation. Human colonies did not beautify what they touched. They adapted to it. Cities assembled from prefabricated modules clung to shattered crusts in irradiated plains. Power grids were exposed, redundant, inelegant. Life support systems were brutal in their efficiency. Everything existed for a single purpose: to keep functioning when failure was inevitable. To us, they were eyesores. To humans, they were home. Their ships followed the same philosophy. I examined dozens of hull schematics recovered through passive scans. Over-armored frames, compartments layered with redundancies, systems designed not to avoid damage, but to operate through it. They did not ask how to remain untouched. They asked how much they could lose and still return alive. This was not how cautious species behaved. What disturbed me further was who they chose to live among. Humans negotiated with border species we avoided, not because they were weak, but because they were unpredictable. They traded with pirate clans the Concord had exterminated twice over, offering logistics, repair expertise, and something far more valuable: reliability. They entered contracts no other species would sign, under conditions that would shatter most sapient psychologies. High-gravity worlds, toxic atmospheres, months of isolation without external contact. They endured it. When Concord observers warned them of the risks, humans responded with casual acknowledgement, smiles, humor, as if danger were an inconvenience rather than a deterrent. Still, they did not provoke us. They paid tariffs without complaint. They registered flight plans. They respected borders we ourselves had drawn through blood and fire. When challenged, they deferred. When pressured, they compromised. When insulted, they laughed. That laughter unsettled me more than defiance ever could. The Council interpreted their behavior as submission, as weakness, as the natural posture of a species that understood its inferiority. "They know their place," one counselor remarked during a closed session. I remained silent, because I was beginning to see the flaw in our reasoning. A species that chooses hostile environments is not avoiding conflict, it is training. A species that normalizes pressure does not break under escalation, it adapts to it. When hardship becomes routine, suffering loses its power as a weapon. Humans did not fear hostility, they expected it. And expectation changes everything. I compiled my findings into a supplemental report, an addendum to my earlier warnings. I noted their logistical networks, their decentralized command structures, their alarming capacity to convert civilian infrastructure into functional survival systems within days. I emphasized one conclusion above all others. If conflict came, humans would not need time to prepare. They were already prepared. The Council reviewed my report in a single session. The vote that followed was swift, unanimous. Operation Firmament was approved not as a war, but as an enforcement action, a reminder, a recalibration of boundaries. The humans, they decided, had grown too comfortable. From the observation chamber, I watched the approval sigils illuminate one by one, ancient symbols of authority activating protocols last used against civilizations that no longer existed. Around me there was satisfaction, confidence, relief. I felt none of it. Instead, I experienced a sensation I had no precise word for, a tightening in my chest cavity, a resonance in my secondary hearts that suggested instinct overriding logic. Dread. Because I understood something the Council did not. You do not remind a species of its place by applying pressure, when pressure is the environment that forged it. As fleets mobilized and orders propagated across Concord space, I pulled archived human transmissions from deep storage, old recordings, cultural artifacts, stories told not to inspire conquest, but endurance. As Operation Firmament moved from planning to execution, I realized, too late, that we were not about to discipline a lesser species. We were about to give humanity exactly what it had been quietly preparing for: a reason. Operation Firmament began with elegance. That is how the Council described it: elegant, restrained, corrective. A demonstration of Concord authority calibrated to end resistance before it could truly exist. The first strike packages were reviewed 3 times, refined to mathematical perfection. No unnecessary loss of life, no prolonged suffering, only precision. By our standards, it was mercy. Human orbital platforms vanished in disciplined bursts of plasma, their silhouettes collapsing into expanding halos of incandescent debris. Shipyards, those crude, sprawling constructions, were severed cleanly from their moorings and reduced to drifting wreckage before alarms could fully propagate. Communication relays fractured in synchronized waves, severing colony from colony, world from world. We waited for panic. Our analysts predicted it within minutes: desperate distress signals, fractured negotiations, frantic appeals routed through neutral intermediaries. We had seen this pattern countless times. Young species always reacted the same way when faced with overwhelming force. But no signals came. Human space went quiet. Not chaotic, not confused. Silent. For 17 standard hours, not a single human transmission breached the void. No civilian chatter, no military response. Nothing but the cold echo of our own fleet movements as Concord armadas advanced through shattered defensive lines unopposed. In the council chambers, confidence bloomed. Councilors spoke openly of timelines now, containment within a cycle, compliance within two. Operation Firmament was already being cited as a textbook example of decisive enforcement. I remained at my station, monitoring the silence. Because silence, I had learned, is not the absence of activity. It is often the sound of focus. The humans spoke again precisely 17 hours after the first strike. They did not address us. There was no broadcast to Concord Command, no plea, no condemnation. Instead, human emergency networks ignited across every remaining colony simultaneously. Systems we had failed to fully map, layered redundancies buried beneath civilian infrastructure. Civilian channels merged seamlessly with military command protocols. Medical networks rerouted into logistics. Industrial systems began reporting new output priorities without central authorization. It was horrifying in its efficiency. I intercepted fragments of their internal communications. Voices overlapped, calm, clipped, purposeful. There was no hysteria, no disbelief. If anything, there was a strange relief. They were not asking if they would survive. They were asking how much they could afford to lose. Within hours, human ships began to move. They were not impressive vessels. Many were decades old by Concord reckoning, mismatched hulls, outdated drives, weapons that should not have threatened even a patrol wing. They did not form clean battle lines. They did not advance toward our strongest positions. They charged past them.
Human strike craft hurled themselves into our formations with suicidal precision, ignoring capital ships to target what mattered most. Fuel tenders ruptured in chain reactions. Command relays vanished in bursts of hard radiation. Logistics vessels, carefully shielded, lightly armed, became debris fields in minutes. They were not trying to win battles. They were trying to make war impossible for us to sustain. I watched a human frigate, its hull already venting atmosphere, deliberately ram a Concord resupply carrier, detonating both in a blast that crippled 3 nearby cruisers. The maneuver violated every known tactical doctrine. And yet, it worked. As engagements multiplied, something became painfully clear. The humans were learning us. Not slowly, not incrementally. They adapted in real time. They baited our pursuit instincts, exploited our hesitation to fire near civilian wreckage, used the debris of their own destroyed ships as cover, as traps, as improvised weapons. They turned ruins into strategy. This was not war as we understood it. There were no glorious engagements, no decisive clashes of power. There was only attrition, bleeding us in places our doctrines had never prioritized, forcing us to choose between advancing and surviving. I filed urgent updates to the Council. I emphasized the pattern, their adaptability, their disregard for loss, their willingness to sacrifice assets we would never expend so casually. The responses I received were patient. "This is expected resistance," one counselor replied. "Desperation masquerading as courage," said another. But I was no longer observing desperation. I was observing intent. For the first time in centuries, a Concord fleet issued a formal request for reinforcements, not a precautionary redeployment, a request born of damage, confusion, and mounting casualties. The signal was brief, almost embarrassed. The Council authorized the reinforcements without comment. Publicly, control was still considered inevitable. Privately, I began to understand the truth. Humanity had not responded emotionally. They had responded structurally. Their entire civilization had shifted modes, not into panic, but into something colder, leaner, purpose-built. Operation Firmament had not broken them, it had unified them. As I reviewed battle projections late into the cycle, one realization eclipsed all others. The humans were no longer reacting to our moves. They were shaping the battlefield around us. And as Concord fleets pushed deeper into human territory, drawn forward by the illusion of momentum, I felt the weight of an approaching certainty. We had struck first, but we were no longer dictating how this war would be fought, and the humans were just getting started. The decision to escalate was framed as mercy. That is how the Council justified it to itself, how it was recorded in the official minutes. A decisive conclusion to prevent prolonged suffering. The humans had resisted longer than projected.
Their tactics were disruptive, annoying, costly. The solution, according to ancient Concord logic, was simple: end their capacity to resist. Planetary bombardment orders were issued with ritual precision. Population centers, designated as dual-use infrastructure, were reclassified. Orbital fire was authorized at levels we had not employed since the Extinction Wars. Entire human cities vanished beneath converging lances of energy, their atmospheres igniting as continents cracked and oceans boiled away into space. From orbit, it was beautiful in a terrible way. Clean lines of destruction, mathematical arcs of annihilation. We expected screams. We expected desperation, fractured transmissions, pleas routed through neutral species, frantic offers of surrender. Instead, I heard laughter. Not broadcast openly, not aimed at us, but captured, fragmented, bleeding through encrypted human military channels as their networks reconfigured faster than our countermeasures could track. Short bursts of sound, breathless, almost relieved. Recognition. That was the moment their war changed. Human command structures dissolved and reformed within a single rotation. Emergency powers unified governments that had despised one another for centuries. Corporate charters were overridden. Civilian manufacturing grids retooled themselves without debate. Mining vessels became weapon platforms. Hospitals became logistics hubs. Research facilities tore down ethical firewalls that had constrained them for generations. Restraints vanished. They stopped asking whether they should do things and focused only on whether they could. I watched classified human research archives surface from deep storage, unlocked by contingency protocols we had never detected. Weapon concepts banned by their own treaties. Experimental technology shelved, not because they were ineffective, but because they were too effective, too dangerous, too indiscriminate. The humans did not attempt to match our firepower. They redefined what firepower meant. The first new weapons reports reached me from a shattered engagement zone near a binary system. Concord cruisers had been advancing through what appeared to be a debris field, the remains of earlier human losses. Then the debris accelerated. Entire asteroids, fragments of moons, wrecked human hulls, flung at relativistic velocities, guided by crude but terrifyingly effective mass drivers. Our shields held for seconds, then failed catastrophically. Ships designed to withstand sustained energy bombardment were pulverized by raw momentum. Elsewhere, autonomous human swarm mines infested hyperspace corridors, learning in real time, coordinating without centralized control. They did not detonate immediately. They waited, observed, adapted, striking only when maximum damage was guaranteed. Most unsettling were the pilots. Human strikecraft began operating without life support signatures. At first, we assumed automation. We were wrong. These were manned vessels, piloted by humans, sealed into armored frames, their biological needs rendered irrelevant. Some were guided by artificial intelligences, slaved to a single directive: mission completion. Survival was not a parameter. They boarded Concorde ships with reckless efficiency, fighting through decompression, radiation leaks, structural collapse. I saw footage, Marines advancing while missing limbs, weapons magnetically locked into shattered armor, moving forward because retreat was no longer an option they recognized. Every loss we inflicted only sharpened them. Where other species recoiled from devastation, humans accelerated into it. Destroyed worlds did not weaken their resolve, they justified it. Each annihilated colony became a rallying cry, a data point in a ledger they were determined to balance. I intercepted a transmission not meant for analysts or diplomats, but for human soldiers alone. It was brief, unadorned, spoken without anger. Permission to abandon restraint. Permission to stop holding back. That was when the truth crystallized in my mind with terrifying clarity. we had not awakened fear. Fear requires uncertainty, doubt, hope that avoidance might still be possible. What we had awakened was something far worse. We had unlocked restraint. Humans had been fighting us with one hand bound, not by inability, but by choice, by ethics, by internal arguments about limits and consequences. Our bombardments had ended those arguments decisively. Now, there were only objectives. Entire Concorde armadas vanished in engagements that defied simulation. Human fleets lured us into gravity wells and collapsed stars behind us, sacrificing entire task forces to erase ours. They hacked our targeting systems mid-battle, feeding false telemetry, turning our own automated defenses against us. They made mockery of our doctrines. And still, they did not gloat. They did not declare supremacy. They did not broadcast threats. They simply advanced. In council chambers, panic finally surfaced, but it was too late for deliberation, too late for restraint to return. Emergency sessions devolved into accusation and denial. How had a species so young become this dangerous? How had we misjudged them so completely? I knew the answer. We had mistaken gentleness for weakness. We had mistaken patience for fear. Humans were not peaceful because they could not be violent. They were peaceful because they knew exactly what violence would cost and waited until it was unavoidable. As reports of collapsing fronts and annihilated fleets flooded my console, one final realization settled over me, cold and absolute. The galaxy had never faced humans unrestrained, and now there was nothing left to stop them. After restraint fell away, the war lost its shape. There were no longer clear fronts, no predictable lines of advance. Conflict spread outward like a fracture through crystal, branching, multiplying, impossible to contain.
Neutral systems burned not because humans targeted them, but because Concorde power structures collapsed within them. Trade routes failed, defense treaties unraveled. Ancient agreements, written to preserve stability, shattered under the weight of a war they had never imagined. Species that once feared the Concorde now watched in silence. Some watched with something dangerously close to hope. Human strike groups appeared everywhere, not in conquering waves, not to plant flags or claim territory. They arrived, dismantled power, and vanished. Shipyards sabotaged beyond repair, command nexuses erased, energy infrastructures rendered permanently unstable. Humans did not occupy space, they denied it. I began to recognize the pattern too late. This was not expansion, it was disassembly, a systematic unmaking of everything that allowed the Concorde to project authority beyond its core. They studied us with obsessive precision. Every encounter, win or loss, was dissected, archived, redistributed across their fleets in near real time. Where we required cycles to revise doctrine, humans adapted between engagements. What we classified as dishonorable, ambushes, false retreats, civilian camouflage, they categorized as efficient. What we called desperation, they called optimization. Psychological warfare, once our most reliable instrument, failed completely. Threats of extinction elicited no panic. Demonstrations of overwhelming force produced no surrender. When we broadcast images of annihilated human worlds, expecting collapse, their response was colder than defiance. Acknowledgement, documentation, escalation. They had faced extinction before, many times, often at their own hands. Climate collapse, nuclear fire, engineered plagues, social implosion. Survival, to humans, was not sacred. It was not an ideal to be preserved at all costs. Continuation was. I saw Concorde commanders resign rather than accept another deployment order. Veterans with centuries of service refused to return to frontline command after witnessing human boarding actions. I reviewed combat footage that should never have been archived. Humans advancing through breached hulls with shattered limbs, their bodies sealed into failing armor, weapons locked into place by magnetic clamps because their hands no longer functioned. They did not fight to live. They fought to finish. The Council demanded escalation in response. Emergency sessions echoed with calls for total war. Genocidal solutions long forbidden were debated openly. Entire species classifications were reconsidered, not as sapients, but as threats to be eliminated. And yet, we hesitated. Not because we lacked the weapons, not because we feared retaliation, but because something had shifted within us. A collective realization, unspoken but universally felt, had begun to take root. If humans were capable of this while outmatched, if they could dismantle an ancient empire with inferior resources and improvised doctrine, what would they become if they ever surpassed us? The projections were unbearable. Stopping humans would require more than victory. It would require transformation. We would have to abandon the very principles that defined the Concord: restraint, hierarchy, the belief that control could be maintained without becoming monstrous. To defeat them, we would have to become something worse. And that was the true stalemate. The war dragged on not because humanity could not be stopped, but because stopping them demanded a price we were no longer certain we were willing to pay. As I compiled casualty reports and watched neutral worlds quietly sever ties with us, I understood with grim clarity. The Concord was not losing territory, it was losing legitimacy. And in war, legitimacy is the first structure to collapse, and the hardest to rebuild. Human strike signatures flared again on my console as I finished the report. Another system, another disruption, another precise removal of something we had once believed permanent. There was no indication they intended to slow. And for the first time since the Concord's founding, I wondered, not whether we could win, but whether we deserved to. No species had ever breached the Concord core. That fact was woven into our identity as surely as our language and law. The core was not merely defended, it was inevitable. Layered fleets orbited every inhabited world in precise geometric formations. Autonomous kill zones overlapped in mathematical perfection. Weapons powered by captured stellar cores slept beneath our cities, capable of reducing entire systems to ash at a command. The core was where wars ended. So when long-range sensors reported human vessels translating into core-adjacent space, the first assumption was error, a calibration fault, radiation interference, wishful thinking born of exhaustion. It was none of those. They arrived battered and jury-rigged, their hulls scarred by 100 engagements, engines held together by visible external bracing. Some ships vented atmosphere as they decelerated, others trailed debris like comets of ruin, and they did not slow. Human vessels rammed defensive platforms head-on, detonating themselves to open corridors through layered shields. Others sacrificed entire task groups to overload autonomous kill nets, burning out systems that had never failed in living memory. They did not retreat when losses mounted. They did not pause to regroup. They advanced. For the first time in Concord history, the core burned. Evacuation orders rippled through ancient cities built before humanity had discovered fire. Archives older than civilizations were purged to prevent capture, their data cores collapsing into singularities of erased history. Symbols that had survived extinction wars, that had watched stars die, were reduced to drifting ash. I stood in the observation sanctum above our capital world as orbital stations went dark one by one. Through reinforced viewports, I watched human marines breach a command ring, beings smaller than us, louder than us, wrapped in scarred armor patched with field welts and blood. They fought like extinction was not a threat, but a memory. I saw humans advance through vacuum without hesitation, tethered only by magnetic clamps and purpose. I saw them ignore wounds that should have killed them, pressing forward because retreat meant nothing to them anymore. Their movements were brutal, inelegant, and unstoppable. Yet even then, they did not unleash total annihilation. They bypassed civilian habitats. They avoided population centers when alternatives existed. Their strikes were precise, horrifyingly so. They targeted command nexuses, data vaults, power distribution hubs, infrastructure, control. They wanted us alive, so we would understand. A single human transmission finally cut through the chaos, routed directly into the council chamber and every remaining command node across the core. It was not a threat, not a declaration of victory. It was terms, nothing more. No demands for territory, no reparations, no declarations of dominance, just an ultimatum framed as an observation. Within the hour, the council dissolved. Some resigned, others fled. A few attempted to authorize final measure weapons and were overruled by systems already compromised. Authority fragmented, then vanished entirely. The Concord, an empire that had endured for millennia, ceased to exist as a unified entity without a final battle.
without a formal surrender. The war ended not with our destruction, but with our submission. As human fleets powered down weapons and established containment patrols rather than occupation zones, I felt something unfamiliar settle over me. Not relief, not shame. Understanding. We had believed power was the ability to destroy. Humans had shown us something far more terrifying. Power was the ability to stop, to choose restraint, only after proving it was no longer necessary. As fires still burned in orbit and emergency signals echoed through the core, one final truth crystallized with devastating clarity. The Concorde had lost not because humanity was stronger, but because humanity had decided the war was over. And when humans decide something must end, it ends. In the aftermath, the galaxy did what it has always done after catastrophe. It rewrote its rules. Classifications were amended first. Species once measured by technological parity, population size, or territorial reach were reassessed under a new metric, one that had not existed before humanity. Humans were quietly removed from Category Amber. No replacement category could adequately contain them. Instead, they became a reference point. Risk was measured against humans. Resilience was compared to humans.
Consequence was calculated by asking a single question. What would humans do in this situation? They did not occupy our worlds. That surprised many. It surprised me most of all. There were no triumphal landings, no banners planted in the ruins of Concorde cities. Human fleets withdrew from civilian orbits once command structures were dismantled. Borders were redrawn with unsettling precision, not to expand their territory, but to reduce friction, to limit escalation, to ensure clarity. Peace, enforced not by domination, but by memory. Their patrols now move through regions once ruled by fear. They do not harass, they do not posture, they simply exist, quiet, heavily armed reminders that certain lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. From my final report as archivist, my last act before the dissolution of the Concorde's historical order, I recorded the lesson we should have learned from the beginning. Humans do not seek war. They argue endlessly among themselves to avoid it. They build treaties, institutions, and fragile systems designed to delay it. They tolerate insult. They absorb loss. They compromise far beyond what most species would endure. But when war is forced upon them, when all avenues of restraint collapse, they end it, decisively, permanently. They endure where others break. They adapt where others ossify. They escalate only when cornered, and when they do, they fight not for glory, not for conquest, but for certainty, to ensure the threat does not return, to close the cycle completely. This is what makes them dangerous. Not their strength, not their numbers, not even their weapons, but their refusal to stop. The younger species now come to me with questions, their voices edged with awe and fear. They ask what humans are. Predators? Protectors? Monsters in waiting? I answer carefully. A species forged not by peace, but by repeated catastrophe. A people who learned again and again that existence is not guaranteed, and that mercy without strength invites extinction. The galaxy is quieter now. Trade routes flow again. Borders hold. Old powers nurse their wounds in silence, and new ones rise more cautiously than before. There is peace, but it is not the naive peace of forgotten danger. It is an informed peace. In the deep dark between stars, human fleets move without fanfare, their presence subtle but unmistakable. They do not threaten, they do not promise. They simply remain. And that is enough, because everyone remembers what happened the last time humanity was underestimated. Everyone remembers that the most dangerous species is not the strongest, but the one that once committed, refuses to stop. And so the galaxy endures, not because humans conquered it, but because they taught it, at terrible cost, exactly where the edge of survival truly lies.